From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Mykel Taylor will talk about what you farmers can do to maintain a mutually beneficial working relationship with your landlords. She urges you to treat those landlords as partners in the operation. She'll go over some recommendations along that line. Also, K-State's Dallas Peterson on addressing glyphosate-resistant kochia problems on crop ground with a pre-plant herbicide treatment as soon as field conditions allow. He'll go over the recommended herbicide options for various cropping scenarios based on K-State field trials. And K-State's Charlie Lee checks in covering a new study on pocket gopher damage control in alfalfa stands. It's all next on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
This is Agriculture Today. Glad to have you along with us once more. We have more principles on managing farmland leases to share with you today, and topical for this time of the year as tenants and landlords hopefully will be coming to conclusions on what those leases will look like in this year ahead. So we've invited back by agricultural economist Mykel Taylor of K-State Research and Extension. She's been sharing some thoughts on managing the leasing relationship at a series of lease workshops that K-State's been hosting lately. This is something of an abstract. Or is it, Mykel, when we think about the structure of these working relationships?
Well, it's interesting because if you ask anybody in Extension, County Extension, or myself, what topic we get asked the most about, it's always about leases. And oftentimes the phone calls that we're getting are not from people wanting to say how much they love their landlord, but instead, how much they struggle with that leasing relationship. And so you start to hear enough stories and you start to talk to enough people and you get a sense that, there might be some ways that we can manage this relationship to be economically beneficial to both of us, as well as building the trust that makes those business relationships work well.
So you want parties, particularly the farmer-tenant, to think this through before they even start the conversation.
Right. I think that we can kind of learn from each other and learn from the mistakes of things that have happened in the past and maybe improve those relationships, because when we get into situations like we're in right now where the farm economy isn't that great, we want to be able to have a frank conversation with our landlords about those rental rates and where they need to be. And they're going to be more open to that conversation if they have a good relationship with you and you've been keeping those lines of communication open during the good years and the bad years.
What's then priority one, or at least the starting point in forging that relationship, do you think?
Communication.
Right.
That's the number one thing, is keeping open the lines of communication. And, there's several aspects to how we do that we can sort of exploit or use to our advantage. And one of those is just understanding who it is you're talking to.
You have some data on that. You've been sharing that at the leasing workshops recently, the demographics that surround the lease on both ends of the deal.
Right. So we know that the vast majority of producers are men, but we have about 40 to 45% of our landowners who are women. And then, I like to ask my audiences, does it make a difference if you're talking to a man or a woman when it comes to negotiating these leases? And the general answer that I get is, well, it shouldn't, but sometimes it does. And that's where we start to talk about, okay, well, who are you talking to? I've had women tell me that their tenant only talks to their husband, even though the land belongs to them. And, that's a situation that you don't want to get into, because that lady is going to be feeling like she's left out of the conversation. I've also had quite a few women who have come up to me and wondered whether or not their tenant even has time to talk to them or would be willing to talk to them. And I think that, number one, I would like those women to be a little more confident and willing to ask, but I would really like those tenants to be very forthcoming with that information and not wait for the tenant to ask, but instead offer up information about current production practices, about the farm bill, about the farm economy, just talking to them about this because they're business partners, and we really want to emphasize that partnership.
On that latter point, in fact, that is beyond just gender. There may be landlords out there with absolutely zero familiarity with crop production, with farm programs, with marketing, so forth.
Right. What we've noticed is a generationally and geographically removed is how I describe it. And we can tell partially, about half of the land is inherited as opposed to purchased, and about half of our landowners live out of county or out of state. So what we have is a situation where people are not necessarily retired farmers. Instead, they are the children or grandchildren of farmers, and they may not be that familiar with the day-to-day operations of agriculture, and they need more information if they're going to really be able to understand how to manage this asset that they have.
There's another demographic that you say bears consideration here, too, and that is the age of the landlord, and maybe that goes to both parties as well.
Right. So based on surveys that we've done in Kansas, the average age of farmers is 59, but the average age of our landowners is almost 73. And so landowners tend to be older. And that's going to affect how we communicate with them. If you can always text them or send them emails, but you might have a landowner that isn't interested in receiving information that way, and they want phone calls or they want letters. So we really have to think about who they are and how they best communicate and work with those avenues.
You must have that connection. That's the bottom line once more.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Another thing that we really encourage them to do is to take pictures and share pictures of harvest, share pictures of the baby calves, do these things so that people understand a little bit more about what's going on. Those pictures are worth 1,000 words, right? Mm-hmm. So we really want to share those as best we can. Some farms do have web pages. Some of them have newsletters. Some of them have Facebook pages. There's a lot of different ways to communicate that information. And as long as you know that your landlord has access to that kind of stuff, you want to share that with them.
All of this is important, and you highlighted this in your presentation as well, Mykel, in that so much land is owned by absentee owners. And when these leasing arrangements are put together, that needs to be kept in mind.
Right. And, we sometimes inherit the leasing arrangement that we get. So we sort of inherit a crop share, and we say, okay, so I'm going to stick with this crop share because that's the way Dad did it or that's the way Grandpa did it. But it's getting harder to do crop share arrangements, I think, when you have a landowner that doesn't understand agriculture and maybe doesn't understand why they're getting bills for different inputs. So again, we need to think about what's the best fit for that landowner. Maybe it is still a crop share, but with a lot of good communication, or maybe they're going to be better suited to a cash lease and not having to try to understand all the nuances of managing it day to day, but instead can get more of an overview.
So a type of lease does make a difference here.
I think it does. I think it does. But you have to be very careful. With cash leases, sometimes we can let the communication fall to nearly zero. We'll write a check, stick it in the Christmas card, and drop it in the mail. And that's not good either. We want to keep up the communication.
Some other factors you bring to folks' attention here. The length of lease, does that need to be reexamined as part of this relationship?
I think we can come to something of an agreement that longer year leases are good for the stability for the farmer. But when we do surveys of how long leases are, it's either 1 year or 3 to 4 years. And so we sort of have these two groups. What I recommend is there's nothing wrong with having a multi-year lease, but maybe, if it's a fixed cash lease, go ahead and renegotiate those rental rates every 2 years just to keep them from getting out of line. So you can have a 5-year lease, but keeping them renegotiated on a regular basis.
And that's back to that regular contact, too.
Yes.
And you say some other data that you passed along actually indicated that the number of landlords one has will figure into the leasing relationships you have with that bunch of people.
Sure. So it's not just a one-to-one ratio. Most farmers who lease ground lease from multiple landowners. And, on average, it's going to be from 4 to 6 landowners. But we have people who have upwards of 50 landowners. And so that in and of itself makes it a challenge for them to keep communications up. And those are the farmers that tend to do newsletters or some other kind of, I call it mass communication with their landlords, because they want to be able to keep up with what's going on. But yeah, it part of the strategy of growing our farms today, we're not going to be able to afford to buy all the ground that we want to farm, so we're going to be leasing ground, and that's going to make it hard to necessarily do crop share leases with everybody because that's a lot of paperwork to manage. So switching to the fixed cash leases as you get more and more landlords is a trend that we're seeing.
By the sound of all this, one might step back and think that this is a high-maintenance undertaking in keeping these relationships going. But you say it's essential that this kind of dialogue and connection continue and happen in the first place.
Well, I think it's essential for a couple of reasons. The first is that this is, the land that's in our portfolio that we're farming is crucial to the success of the business. So, we need that ground. We need to be able to make sure that we have it. And if we manage these relationships well, then it becomes such a sure thing, and we're so confident in that relationship that we start to feel like we know we're going to have that ground for a while, and we farm it as if it's our own. And that's a good place to be, is when you're farming it like it's your own ground. The other thing is that during times where the farm economy isn't doing very well and you want to have that serious conversation about maybe dropping the rent, I think that they're going to be more open to it if they have understood during the years when things are good and you've communicated things well, so that they understand that farming has its ups and downs. We don't want to leave it with, my landowner doesn't know anything about ag and they don't want to. Right. That's just an excuse to, not have to worry about it. And what it comes down to is it takes time. It takes time for us to maintain these relationships, but I think it's worth it.
And it comes down to, as well, as you mentioned earlier, the mindset that your landlord is a partner in the business with you.
Absolutely. They're business partners. They only make money if you farm their ground, and you only make money if you farm their ground. So you guys need to work together and come to a good business partnership agreement on how you're going to manage this ground.
Thanks, Mykel, for coming over, sharing these thoughts.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Mykel Taylor, agricultural economist with K-State Research and Extension. She's been discussing managing cropland leasing arrangements at the recent lease workshops that K-State has been holding around Kansas. And this is Agriculture Today. We'll return with more in a moment on the K-State Radio Network. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. These next few weeks would be an excellent time for you crop producers to at least take a look at controlling kochia with a pre-plant application. And our guest now is going to go over this option and things to consider there. Dallas Peterson is a weed management specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And Dallas, we're going to be fighting winter conditions, it seems, as we discuss this. But kochia, as troublesome as it's become, as resistant to herbicides, some different kinds of strategies are required here, right?
Yeah, we've really had to rethink our kochia management options and plans in recent years, especially because of the development of resistance, and most notably to glyphosate, especially in kochia as well as the other species. We've had to change our management strategies, and that certainly is the case with kochia because it has such a kind of a unique germination pattern.
And this gets right at why we're talking about this alternative here in mid to late February.
Yeah, kochia, we consider it to be a summer annual weed, but it's probably the earliest germinating summer annual weed that we know of. We have our winter annuals. Those germinate in the fall and overwinter and then resume growth in the spring. Our summer annuals will germinate in the spring typically, and then they'll grow through the summer and reproduce and die in the fall. And kochia does fit that pattern, but it sometimes will start to germinate early February even, especially in the southwestern part of the state. And so if you're having a hard time controlling it post-emergence with those options that we have available to us, then we might have to think about using residual herbicides that have to be on and activated before it germinates. And so when it comes up so early in the spring, that means you have to get those applications out early. Some research here conducted at K-State as well as in Wyoming and Nebraska and Colorado where they kind of followed the germination patterns of kochia, found that about 90% of all the kochia that germinated during a season germinated actually by the 1st of April. And again, depending on where you're at and what your moisture conditions are and the seasonal variation, again, oftentimes it will start to come up in February, and a majority of it will be done coming up by the 1st of April. You will continue to get some germination actually right through the summer. But again, if you can control that big early flush, that's really helpful from a management standpoint.
So the earlier the better here, if weather permits, and that's going to be part of the equation this year, isn't it?
It really is. And, in the past 2 or 3 years, we've even talked about going out, with some late fall treatments, December-type treatments with residual herbicides. And if not doing it then, late January through February, but again, trying to get a lot of those out before the 1st of March when it really starts to germinate. Now, I guess the good thing is that it's been so cold, that it hasn't started to germinate yet, but we know that we've got the moisture there. And so, again, once it does start to warm up, we will probably start to see that kochia germinating. And good chance in many of these fields, we're not going to be able to get it out there and get those residuals applied before some of that starts to come up, just from a standpoint of being able to get onto those fields.
Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that March is more accommodating for field work. One can get in and make these applications. The chemistry one chooses against kochia will be in a fair part dependent upon what crop you're going to following that treatment.
It will, and because we probably will have some coming up before we're able to get out there, get our residuals on before it germinates, we're going to have to include something in those treatments that hopefully can give us some, quote, burn down control of those few that have come up early on as well. And dicamba really fits into that kind of role, if you will. We've used dicamba for many, many years. Banville originally, and then Clarity, and now we have a number of other dicamba products. But it's been kind of our go-to herbicide for kochia control. And the good thing about kochia is that it has both foliar activity as well as some soil residual activity. Now, we have found some kochia populations that have developed resistance to post-emergence applications of kochia, but still the soil applications seem to be working fairly well for us. And maybe even if it is emerged, we still can get enough uptake through the roots on that young stuff that it will control it. The other nice thing about dicamba is that it's very water soluble, so it takes just a little bit of moisture to activate it, as opposed to a lot of our other residual herbicides where we need maybe at least a half an inch of precipitation or more to get good activation of those herbicides. So dicamba almost always should be a part of that treatment to get control of anything that might have come up, as well as provide some really early season residual control until the other herbicides can then kick in maybe and provide extended residual later into the season.
And those other herbicides that would be added to the dicamba as a base compound would again be relevant to whether you're going to corn, grain sorghum, soybeans, or another crop.
Yeah, it really does. And, if you're going to corn or sorghum, atrazine still is a standard treatment that can be very effective on kochia. We have some atrazine-resistant kochia as well. So there might be some pockets where it's not going to do as good as we'd like. But again, it really has worked well, at least in a lot of our research at Tribune, for example, at the experiment field there. And again, a dicamba-atrazine combination standard. Now, you can have other residual herbicides along with that as well. And a couple that have become fairly commonly used for corn are Corvus and Balance. Those have the active ingredient isoxaflutol in them. And again, that herbicide is good for kochia. It's also good for pigweed, but unfortunately, these herbicides that we put down that early are not going to last long enough to give us good pigweed control through the season. So again, we'll have to add something to them at a later date. But those would probably be the primary treatments in corn. Now, you cannot use the isoxaflutol on sorghum. And so, again, we're a lot more limited there. Really, primarily, we are looking at dicamba and atrazine for some early season kochia control ahead of planting grain sorghum.
What's the strategy then, Dallas, in as far as following with a soybean planting?
Well, soybeans, obviously, we have to look at a different group of herbicides. We can't use atrazine. You can still use dicamba if you're far ahead of planting soybeans enough. And again, if you're putting it out late February, let's say, or even through the month of March, in most cases, we still have an adequate time frame in there before we plant our soybeans that we can do that. Now, you do have to follow the label guidelines, of course, with dicamba. And there actually are some restrictions in areas with annual rainfall less than 25 inches. So I'd refer you to the label to make sure that you're consistent with what those label guidelines are. In soybeans, probably the residual herbicide that has been most effective at providing kochia control are those that contain the active ingredient sulfentrazone. And that includes all the Authority products. There's a bunch of Authority mixes, if you will. Authority MTZ, for example, is one of the real common ones that has been used in that early application for residual kochia control. It has the sulfentrazone plus metribuzin, or good old Syncor, in it. So, again, that's been a very good one ahead of soybeans. Valor or flumioxazin-containing herbicides also have kochia on the label, but to be honest with you, our research would say that the sulfentrazone products are just a lot better for the residual kochia control than the Valor-type products are. So we would probably encourage farmers to consider a sulfentrazone-based product for those early treatments for kochia ahead of soybeans. And the same is true for sunflowers. Sulfentrazone also can be used ahead of sunflowers. So there we probably would be looking at, for example, Authority Elite or Authority Supreme for both soybeans and sunflowers. That's a combination of the sulfentrazone and Zidua. Zidua is also can be used in corn. Kind of forgot about that one in corn, but it also can be used ahead of corn. And again, we like the mixes to have multiple effective sites of action in those treatments. But Zidua can also provide decent kochia control. It definitely does require more rainfall for activation. So again, by itself, probably not adequate, but in a mix, it's just going to add to that overall kochia control.
If one is applying against kochia on to-be fallow ground ahead of wheat planted this coming fall, for instance, the game changes a bit there, doesn't it? It
does, and again, you have to be aware of what your recrop restrictions are with various things. For example, you can't use atrazine in that application if you're planning to plant wheat in the fall. So again, dicamba is a component. Metribuzin fits in there. Metribuzin works a lot like atrazine, but it's shorter lived. And so, again, you can use that in that treatment. You can actually even use, again, the Authority MTZ if you get it on early enough. Okay, so again, I would refer you to the label to make sure that you leave that interval in there that is required. But that will help us give us some of that residual control and perhaps reduce, some weed control operations that might be required through the spring and summer.
The label is always good reading, as is the Chemical Weed Control Guide for Field Crops from K-State. The 2019 version, of course, is now out, and it will detail all of these alternatives. Also, check out the article on this topic entitled Late Winter Pre-Plant Applications for Kochia Control in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter, the February 8th edition at agronomy.ksu.edu. Dallas, as always, we appreciate the input. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Weed Management Specialist Dallas Peterson, K-State Research and Extension, with us on Agriculture Today. We'll resume with more after this break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You are listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And on we go now to today's agricultural news headlines in review, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, trade negotiations between the U.S. and China have resumed this week in Washington after both sides reported progress during last week's talks in Beijing, with that March the 1st deadline looming over the talks. Following the talks last week, Chinese officials and the White House both confirmed the plans for more mid- and high-level talks this week in Washington. The White House said it hopes to see additional progress as negotiations continue. Extensive technical exchanges between the professional staffs of both countries lead to detailed and intensive discussions. Those the words of White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders in the statement following the talks. While progress was made, she says much work remains to resolve outstanding issues before the March 1st deadline, when the U.S. is set to increase tariffs to 25% on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. Structural issues, including the forced technology transfer, intellectual property rights, cyber theft, agriculture, services, non-tariff barriers, and currency, continue to be the focus of U.S. negotiators, according to Sanders. Reports suggest a significant gap remains on those issues, which the U.S. has insisted be part of any final agreement. Meantime, Sanders noted that commitments by China to purchase more U.S. goods and services are also a factor in negotiations, and any such commitments will be included in a memoranda of understanding between the two countries. Meantime, Deere & Company said that farmers are delaying purchases of machinery as they wait for a resolution of trade standoffs between the U.S. and major foreign buyers of farm commodities, such as China. The company said Friday that initial orders of tractors, combines, and other equipment were weak, contributing to the lower-than-expected quarterly profits. Deere said farmers are closely watching that March the 1st deadline for the potential trade settlement between the U.S. and China. The U.S. again threatening to impose more tariffs on March the 2nd if the deal is not reached. Exports of U.S.-grown soybeans to China collapsing last year, China imposing a tariff in retaliation for U.S. duties on hundreds of manufactured goods from China. Even without a trade deal, Deere is betting that farmers will step up their purchases of equipment later in the year to replace older machinery. The company maintained guidance issued in November for net income of $3.6 billion in its fiscal year ending in October, and raised its global sales growth outlook for farm equipment to 4%, up from 3%. Revenue from farm and turf equipment rising 10% during the company's fiscal first quarter, but the company said sales are weighted toward smaller, lower-margin equipment. As a result, profit from the farm unit slipped 10% from a year earlier, down to $348 million. For the quarter, Deere reported a net income overall of $498.5 million. That compared with a loss of $531 million a year earlier. At the Weed Science Society of America's annual meeting in New Orleans last week, dicamba off-target movement was a hot topic. Scientists are trying to understand how and why dicamba is moving off-target. That's a topic that many weed scientists in the Midwest and the South have spent the past 2 years studying. Weed scientists' efforts are slowly uncovering why new formulations of dicamba, the XtendiMax, Fexapan, and Ingenia technology, have moved beyond treated fields to injure millions of acres of non-tolerant soybeans and other vegetation for 2 consecutive years, and why some regions seem so much more affected than others. The WSSA devoted an entire symposium to the topic of dicamba off-target movement at its annual meeting, and they found several major conclusions emerging there. First, academic scientists believe volatility of the herbicides is happening and was a major contributor to off-target damage in both 2017 and 18. Second, they are closely closing in on key environmental factors that make volatility more likely to occur and cause off-target damage. Those factors include a warm, humid weather, temperature inversions as well, and low pH of a dicamba tank mix, often the result of adding glyphosate to the mix, according to the researchers there. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Now, the weekly feature for you dairy producers from the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at K-State. Milk lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning some of the interesting data coming out of the Central Order for the year of 2018. You know, we talk about milk price and some other things, and no, milk price was not very exciting during 2018 for our dairy farmers here in the Central Order. However, there is one stat that really stood out to me as I reviewed the annual data published by our milk marketing administrator. One of the key things that I've seen that our producers have been able to do in the Central Order is they've been able to reduce the somatic cell count of the milk that they're delivering to our various processing plants. And really, hats off to them. This is a very tough job, something that requires attention daily, and something that we must always be working toward to keep these cell counts low. For you as the consumer, there's some advantages to that. Lower cell counts in the raw milk coming into the processing plant will increase the shelf life of fluid milk, also increases the quality of other dairy products that you consume. So, how low are these cell counts? Well, for most of the year, our dairy farms delivered milk to the processing plants that was less than 200,000 in somatic cell count. This is a great drop from what it was if you go back to, say, 2000. Back in 2000, the average somatic cell count of milk delivered to our processing plants was over 300,000. So this is a significant decrease in somatic cell count of the raw milk coming into our plants in the Central Order. How has the dairy farmers done this? Well, it's a lot of hard work. It involves providing a very clean environment for the dairy cows, because part of the mastitis that they deal with, which results in an increase in somatic cell count, is a result of the environment that they lay in and are exposed to. So they have done an excellent job of improving the housing as well as the environment that the cow is housed in. They've also improved their techniques in milking, treatment of mastitis, and in particularly the teat-end health that their animals have. This is all done by improving our consistency in the milking procedure, as well as making sure that our milking equipment is adjusted correctly and maintained to a high degree. So, this is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, saying hats off to our dairy farmers here in the Central Order, that includes Kansas, that have been working very diligently to reduce somatic cell count over the last couple of decades.
And we echo those sentiments right here. Mike, many thanks. Next up, our weekly wildlife management segment here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggle to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
This Agriculture Today concludes with our weekly visit featuring wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, a word today on pocket gophers. Their damage to crop fields, and largely here in Kansas, we find them really ripping up alfalfa stands, right?
Yeah, pocket gophers are one of the most damaging pests in alfalfa, really throughout the western part of the United States. There's a variety of methods available to manage pocket gopher populations, and it would include such things as flood irrigation and basically just flooding them out, habitat modification by trying to remove the plants that pocket gophers feed on, trapping, rodenticide baiting, burrow fumigation, or all techniques that have been used, but really none of those approaches have been studied very well or compared at the same time to determine which control technique seems to be most effective. When we look at the amount of damage that pocket gophers can do in an alfalfa field, not only by thinning the stand and their mound building, which causes the swather to be raised up higher so you're leaving more of the alfalfa plant in the field rather than harvesting it, can result in damages that have been estimated from 20 to 70% of the potential yield. That's pretty significant, and consider that damage is on each cutting. It's always been surprising to me that folks that are in the alfalfa production business don't take a more proactive approach to trying to manage pocket gophers. I think many of them are concerned that the techniques are very labor-intensive and perhaps think it's too labor-intensive and too expensive for the yields that they've been able to achieve in the places that they have tried pocket gopher management.
But it surely can be worthwhile to respond if that damage is pushing as much as 70%. You say that the effectiveness of the various treatments against pocket gophers has not been extensively studied, although there is a new research effort out of California looking at a couple of options here.
The research report in California was published in 2016, and it dealt with different species of pocket gophers than we have here. They dealt with Bada and northern pocket gophers in alfalfa fields. Here in Kansas, we have two species, the plains pocket gopher and the yellow-faced pocket gopher. The burrowing habits and food requirements are very similar amongst those species. So even though the study that we'll talk about was done in California, we could certainly apply those techniques to the pocket gopher species we have here in Kansas. What they did there, they had 9 alfalfa fields along the California-Oregon border, and they selected those alfalfa fields because of moderate to heavy pocket gopher infestations, and then decided to test with 4 treatments. The treatments that were applied was the use of a gophinator trap. So that trapping would have been one of the treatments. They used aluminum phosphide, a common fumigant that is registered for the control of pocket gophers in alfalfa fields, a pressurized exhaust system that uses a combustible engine and an air compressor to pump carbon monoxide into the burrows, which would be a technique that is not registered in Kansas but is done occasionally, and then the control. So those were the 4 treatments that they compared. They looked at efficacy, they looked at cost of those treatments for 2 different years and multiple times of application per year. The first year, they only did 1 treatment. In subsequent years, they did 2 and sometimes 3 treatments. So their efficacy ratings were somewhat underwhelming, in my opinion. None of the treatments, the first time they were applied, received greater than 70% efficacy. Keep in mind that EPA considers that 70% as the bottom line of whether a product would get a registration. So you would think that most of these products would receive such of a score, but it just goes to show you that pocket gopher management is not easy, and it's not automatically highly effective in a single treatment. Now, after looking at multiple treatments within a year, the efficacy certainly increased. I think that's the key thing that come out of this, that 2 treatments in a year is certainly a much faster way to reduce pocket gopher populations. The other thing is, I think, that have been important and we've utilized for many years is to try to get people involved in pocket gopher management and control before the population gets at high levels. The more dense populations we have out there, the more unlikely it is you're going to achieve a measurable amount of success in a single treatment.
But again, amongst the options, the aluminum phosphide fumigation, the carbon monoxide fumigation, the trapping, none of those are superior to the other, it sounds.
Well, the aluminum phosphide had the shortest time for application, so it doesn't take very long to poke a probe hole in the burrow system, drop 2 to 4 aluminum phosphide pellets in, close the system, and move on. Keep in mind that pocket gophers are territorial for most part of the year. One burrow system contains one pocket gopher. So you have to be able to distinguish burrow systems from each other. So there are some challenges with doing that. When costs were amortized over time, trapping was the most cost-effective approach, even though it took a longer time for application. The aluminum phosphide was more effective than the combustible engine exhaust machine. They would have ranked aluminum phosphide and trapping very similar, but both were significantly greater than the combustible engine carbon monoxide machine.
So is it best to use these products singularly, or is there a chance that they might be used in combination for greater efficacy?
Well, as with many techniques, I think the combination of several control techniques is likely to provide the best long-term solution to pocket gopher damage.
Well, pocket gophers are a problematic pest for alfalfa growers here in the state of Kansas, and drawing from this recent study out of California, there are some thoughts on controlling these rodents. Charlie, thanks for sharing the word right here. He's a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. And with that, our Tuesday edition comes to a close. We appreciate you being along with us and invite you to rejoin us this same time right here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.